Good morning, sir.
Good morning. What is your name?
My name is Lalu.
Hi, Mr. Lalu Pandey. Explain me full story of the address.
Okay. The Address is a short story by Marga Minko, a Dutch writer. Curriculum and deals with themes of loss, memories, identity, and the impact of war. Here's a detailed summary and analysis of the story. Summary of The Address. The story revolves around the young woman who is the narrator, recalling her experiences during and after World War II, particularly focusing on the loss of her family and the return of her possessions. The narrator's background story begins with the narrator, a young woman, who had lived through the devastation of World War II. She recalls her family's Jewish background, the suffering, and the displacement caused by the war. She had to go into hiding and had lost contact with her family. After the war, she returns to the place where her family once lived, looking for her mother's belongings, which had been handed over to a woman named Mrs. Dorling for safekeeping during the war. Mrs. Dorling had taken the narrator's family's possessions when they had to leave in a hurry, and the narrator hopes to recover them. The visit to Mrs. Dorling's house. The narrator recalls the address of Mrs. Dorling, where the items were kept, and decides to visit her. When she arrives at the house, it is apparent that much has changed. The home is now occupied by a different family, and the narrator is faced with an uncomfortable reality. Mrs. Dorling, who had been responsible for keeping the belongings, is unrecognizable to the narrator. She is rude and indifferent, showing no emotional connection to the narrator's past or her family. The woman doesn't seem to care about the items she took and treats the narrator with disdain. The narrator soon realizes that the woman is not just disinterested in returning the belongings, but also has changed the entire atmosphere of the house into something cold and alien. Recollection of past events. As the narrator tries to retrieve her belongings, she notices how the house feels foreign to her. The once familiar items, furniture, silverware, and belongings of sentimental value, are now treated as ordinary objects by Mrs. Dorling and her family. These belongings, which once held so much meaning, are now of little importance to the new inhabitants. The narrator experiences a deep sense of loss, not just of her belongings, but also of the emotional connection she had with them and her family. She feels as though she has lost her home and identity. She understands that the war has not only taken away her family, but also left her disconnected from her past and heritage. The conclusion of the story ends with the narrator realizing that the physical things that she once thought were valuable, her family's belongings, no longer hold the same meaning for her. She leaves Mrs. Dorling's house, unable to reclaim what she had lost. In the end, the narrator acknowledges that the real loss was not the physical objects, but the emotional connection to her family and home, which cannot be restored. Themes of The Address. Loss and displacement. The central theme of the story is the loss experienced during and after the war. The narrator loses not only her family, but also her connection to her past and identity. The war has robbed her of the emotional and physical stability that she once had. Memory and identity. The narrator's belongings symbolize memories of her family and home. The story explores how memories are tied to objects and places, and how these memories change or fade when the physical objects are no longer accessible or meaningful. The impact of war. The story highlights the personal and emotional consequences of war. While the war may end, its effects are long-lasting, and people continue to struggle with loss, trauma, and the disconnection it brings. The inhumanity of Mrs. Dorling. Mrs. Dorling's behavior reflects the indifference and cruelty that sometimes accompanies human survival instincts. She has taken advantage of the narrator's family's suffering and shows no compassion. Her coldness further emphasizes the sense of alienation the narrator feels. Alienation. The narrator's sense of alienation is evident as she feels disconnected not only from her family's belongings, but also from the world around her. The house she enters no longer feels like a place she belongs, and the items she sought to reclaim no longer offer the comfort they once did. Analysis of characters. The narrator. The young woman is the central character, representing the emotional and physical toll of the war. She struggles to reconcile the loss of her family and the changes that have occurred in her life. Through her journey, we see her gradual understanding that the loss of her family cannot be compensated for by material things. Mrs. Dorling. Mrs. Dorling represents the callousness of people who were unaffected by the war's emotional consequences. She took the belongings without any sense of duty or empathy, treating the narrator with indifference. Her actions reflect how the war had turned some people into opportunistic individuals who cared little about the suffering of others. Conclusion: The Address is a poignant exploration of the emotional aftermath of war. It deals with the themes of loss, memory, and identity, as well as the disillusionment that often accompanies the search for lost things, both material and emotional. The narrator's realization that objects cannot replace the emotional and familial bonds that have been severed is a powerful message about the irreparable nature of loss. The story is a reminder of the deeper, more personal impact of war, beyond just the physical destruction it causes. It shows that while things can be rebuilt, the emotional toll and loss of identity are much harder to recover from.